Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of four conversations in the Arts and Education Council's 2021 Catalyst Conversation Series. A few housekeeping items. Just want to let you know that this session is being recorded and streamed Facebook Live. A few, we will be muting everyone's microphones and ask that you remain on mute. If you have a question or comment, please utilize the chat feature. We will have someone monitoring it. So let's hop in. Catalyst Conversations is a series of casual conversations, some playful, some serious, that invite you to experience the arts through a different lens. Today's topic is arts and equity with lead conversationalist Kristian Blackmon. I will turn it over to Jessiree in a few minutes to introduce herself and Kristian. But before we get there, I want to tell you a little bit about Arts and Education Council and what we have been working on as it pertains to equity. My name is Cynthia Davis, Director of Grants and Programs. My role at the Arts and Education Council is to ensure good stewardship of the generous donations of our donors. I manage a variety of arts and arts education grants and programs that make our community a great place to live, work, and play. In this role, I get to experience firsthand the incredible joy that children and adults experience through our grants and programs. The Arts and Education Council is an organization that believes that by supporting a variety of art forms and providing strategic leadership for the arts in the broader community, we can create an environment where the growing impact and ripple effect of the arts is felt and celebrated by the entire community. A region rich with arts and cultural experiences is critical to creating and sustaining vibrant communities with programs and grants funded by private donations from people like you that keep art happening for millions of people across the St. Louis region. 2020 was a year of multiple compounding and ongoing crises in the United States in the form of direct and indirect effects of COVID-19, as well as the rightful cause for racial justice from communities across the country. Shifts in investment and giving practices, strategy development, or operations has provided the opportunity for A&E to respond more nimbly to emerging needs and work towards longer-term equity goals. On today, during this Catalyst conversation, we are proud to publicly announce our Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Framework and Statement of Equity that will be used across all funding programs and organizational processes and practices. Applicants will begin to see this language emerge prominently and be strongly suggested in 2021, but become a required practice in 2022. The Arts and Education Council's Board of Directors approved the Statement of Equity. This is our new Statement of Equity. To support a full creative life for all, the Arts and Education Council commits to championing policies and practices of diversity, equity, and accessibility that empower a just, inclusive, equitable region. This new philosophy will allow A&E to achieve a goal and objective of an equitable giving outlook that will maintain a balance within our resource distribution, i.e., mainly our grant making. The objective is to have an equitable giving outlook. The goal is to maintain a balance in where our resources go. Overall, we want to achieve artistic diversity. We want different results from more diverse audiences. We want to stop thinking about grant making in terms of dollars and or organizations, but in terms of art forms and or program investments. There will be more information in the coming months about the implementation of this framework. But now let's get to why you're really here. Jessiree, you're up.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Jessiree Jenkins. I am Grants and Programs Coordinator here at the Arts and Education Council, and I assist and support Cynthia in serving our community, our arts community. Today we have with us Kristian Blackmon. She's a St. Louis native, is a community organizer, art curator, activist, facilitator, trainer, and has done work in both radio and event hosting. She's curated work with at least 30 established and emerging artists and facilitated leadership development training with up to 300 participants, both locally and nationally. Thanks for joining us, Kristian, and for lending your expertise in this subject area. For those of you on the call, we want participation. So you can type in the chat, ask us questions. We want this to be a fully engaged experience for all involved. So let's hop right in. Kristian, what does equity look like in the arts world?
Thank you, Jessiree. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you again for having me. This is an honor and I'm super appreciative of it. Ask that one more time, Jessiree. I'm sorry.
What does equity look like in the arts world?
Equity in the art world for me looks like everyone having access to it. So for artists, for folks in the community to be able to have access, and access meaning that they're able to have education around art, being able to be creative, to create art, to be able to come and experience art in different spaces within their community. Um, and particularly with artists of color and communities of color, specifically Black artists and Black communities. There's clearly, we're talking about arts and equity, there's clearly an imbalance of what that looks like. So I know there's a couple questions, I don't know if we put it in the chat already, but one of the questions being around that a probing question was like, what does it really look like to make art accessible amongst many, many demographics and many, many lanes? So what I have come to find out doing curating work, specifically here in St. Louis, is where at one point my curating really started before I even called myself a curator. My work started with wanting to address different issues within my community, specifically centering Black women and Black girls. What I found very quickly was that just how many folks don't even know or have access to art and don't even know about that there's Black artists here, right here from their city that does amazing work. So where originally my curating came up with like, I have these ideas, I have these themes I want to tap into. I was lucky to have some relationships with artists at the time when I first started doing this in 2012. But over the course of time, building relationships with different artists, what I also came to realize and see in my curating was just what we're talking about now, was that being able to provide space and provide a platform for artists to simply be and not just to create, but for their work to be able to be actually on a wall in a show in an exhibition. And that not only can they create, but that they can also get paid for that work, right? So it's not the phrase, struggling artist. It's nothing like being able for someone to actually pay for something that you create. And then the other piece was that, again, like I said, to reiterate, but I think it's really, really important, is that folks in the community, Black folks specifically, being able to come in a space and be able to have an art experience, to be in and having that art experience with individuals that look like them, with artists that look like them. Real quick, for those that follow some of the stuff I do, excuse me. One of the shows that I've done over the course of the years is a Tupac tribute show. So, and celebrating the art and the music and the life of Tupac Shakur. And that particular show, really, the first year I did it was a few years ago. What I found out with that show really was that folks that came out were just coming out because like they love Tupac, right? But in having some of those conversations with some of the folks that came out, was that they had never been to like an art show. They had never had an experience where they come and they see art on walls. And then some of them being super surprised that these artists were from St. Louis. So it wasn't this one-off abstract thing where they, you only hear about artists coming from big cities like a New York or an LA, or hearing the history of Black artists that had come before us during the Harlem Renaissance or different eras in time, that they were actually able to see artists in real time right here from St. Louis. So the equitable piece looks like being able to have that access, being able for our kids, for our youth to be able to have programming, to be able to do art, to learn art, to be able to create art, to be able to be in these different spaces. And then I think the other piece is also, what does it look like to have these Black spaces? There aren't a lot of Black galleries here in St. Louis, and there aren't a lot of Black-led institutions like an Herb Arts, which I've done a lot of work with over the years, that not only have art shows and curated shows, but they also have actual programming where they go into schools and work with youth, that they work with adult artists. There isn't a lot of that. And if there is that, the funding does not funnel the same way that it funnels to other institutions, and particularly larger institutions, specifically white-led institutions. So I think that the equitable piece looks like, how are we all doing work, not just having these conversations, but actually putting the words into practice so that these things continue to shift.
Thank you, Kristian. So in hearing that explanation and answer, it makes me think of the appreciation of art. So with that specific Tupac show that you do, it brought all of these new people into the art world, and it gave them a new appreciation for the different types or different facets of Tupac's work. What can we do as funders and advocates of the arts and aiding and making the climate more accessible for Black artists and Black art institutions?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think first to be very clear, and being very aware of how everybody doesn't operate the same in how they view art and how they create art. So sometimes with funding, and I'm saying this as a person who's applied for grants to do some of my work, and the process in order to get grants oftentimes is very, very tedious, very, very difficult. And I know a lot of times institutions do create and provide workshops and different things that they can come and talk about. How do you go through the process of applying for a grant? How do you go through the process of understanding what this means? However, I still think that there's, again, this imbalance of the access that people have in order to be preview to those conversations and those workshops, and also just be preview to grants, period. And also you find that there's a ton of artists, there's a lot of folks that are trying to get funding, whether it's an individual artist, whether it's a curator, whether it's a group, an organization, et cetera, et cetera. So I think reinventing some of the ways in which folks are able to apply for grants. And if you're an emerging artist, or if you're someone who hasn't necessarily been doing art for a long time, or even if you have, you may just be an individual that just makes art, right? You've never been in any type of communication, relationship with the gallery, with the museum, with the institution that does art. So you might not even know where to start. So how are things being put into place to tap into these different demographics and with these different folks in different parts of the community, so that instead of them having to come to said thing, how are folks coming to them in order to aid them through the process? And also, I think just really realizing and recognizing that there are a lot of amazing Black artists. Just first off, like knowing that. Because I think a lot of times, because you only know what you see sometimes. And oftentimes, if you're only seeing a particular type of artist that looks a particular way, it may not even come to your mind that there are Black artists or artists of color. And I think also it's thinking about also truly respecting and respecting the gifts, skills, and talents of Black artists. Oftentimes, Black artists get exploited, whether it be they're not paid at all, or they're underpaid, or they're pulled from particular communities that have cultivated them and their place in other places. And I'm not saying that artists should not grow and evolve, absolutely. But I think it's something to say about when you remove particular artists from communities that cultivate them and that they're familiar with, and putting them into another environment that they feel either the only in or only a few in, and they're not looked at as sometimes as human, but they're looked like as just a product, or they're looked at as an anomaly, right? So I think it's these multiple different pieces outside of just, hey, how do they get money, but how do you also make sure that you're taking care of them holistically, and how you're looking out for them holistically, and that you're not forgetting about communities in which Black artists come from, right? So getting back to what I said around how are we making sure that all these communities still have access to Black artists and Black art. So I think looking at how funding is funneled, how it's funneled, where it's funneled, thinking about and remembering how to meet artists and communities and folks where they are, you fund and they can apply for grants, and then also making sure that Black artists aren't exploited, because I mean, quite frankly, most Black artists, at least a lot of the Black artists I know, they underprice their work, they undervalue their work, and part of that is because they want to sell it. First off, also recognizing the community in which are the people that may be coming, like a lot of folks that come into like they're Black as well, so they may not have disposable income to buy art, even if they want to. I mean, I use myself as an example. I pride myself on being able, like, to, at this point, I feel like I am an art collector, and I've been blessed to be able to collect art from many artists, many of my artist friends and family. But a lot of that art I know could have gone for more. One, and for two, oftentimes, like I've paid for art on like payment plans. Some artists provide that as well. But you don't always see that. You really probably won't see that in a lot of other spaces. So I think it's like a multitude of all those things that folks need to be thinking about, in how they're thinking about supporting Black artists and supporting them holistically in that way. Hopefully I answered.
You gave me a lot of nuggets to pull in from. And so in that response, can you speak a little bit more about the exploitation of Black art and Black artists, and also the conformity that takes place when artists of color or Black artists are asked to move out of their space to become more palatable for the general public?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm trying to think of where to start because this is like an ongoing conversation that I have often. But yeah, the exploitation. I mean, people need to be real. Like Black people of color are exploited in society, period, right? So why would they not be exploited in the art world, especially given that, you know, there's a culture and a theme around like how we view how white supremacy and whiteness shows up in a way, right? And there has been a point where work done by Black artists wasn't even considered art. It wasn't even considered something valuable. It wasn't even considered some viewing, right? So that's the lineage, that's the history, and that isn't something that is totally gone now. I still think that there are institutions that ultimately don't view Black artists and the art that Black folks and people of color make as something worth being valued in a way. And if it is valued, again, I think there's a lot of tokenizing in that, right? So there are specific artists and particular artists of color that get chosen in a way sometimes to be able to be in other spaces, in bigger spaces, to have more access, to be able to be known. So I think, again, we need to be careful about tokenizing artists, specifically artists of color, specifically Black artists, and and not trying to meet quotas and not trying to say, oh yeah, well, we have these X amount of artists, so we're good now. And again, I think it's super important to, again, and this is something that is super important to me, again, is like removing artists from gallery spaces, from different art spaces that are Black led out of communities and putting them in other places. Like, how are you making sure that that transition is, you know, if that transition is beneficial to the artist as well? It should be more beneficial to the artist than to the institution. And man, I'm trying to keep my thoughts focused because they're all over the place with this particular question. But yeah, I think that I've seen artists, I've literally been in spaces and I've seen folks come to an event that artists were present, Black artists were present, and instead of, you know, though, and this has been individuals from like other institutions that have come to an event somewhere, and instead of connecting with the institution and doing some type of a collaborative thing, they've gone straight to the artist and literally have pulled an artist from this space for them to come into their space. And so again, artists should be able to evolve and do work wherever they so choose and wherever they please. But I think it's something to say about when you intentionally go around to pull artists from their community to utilize them and use them in your space, and you don't even look back to what then happens when that now community has a void from that artist. So I think you're not only exploiting the artists, but you're also exploiting Black-led institutions. You're also exploiting the community in a way that isn't helpful. And again, I think it's something to also to say about when you continue to do work in spaces that's not within the community. So you want to work with Black artists, you want to have more Black artists and artists of color to be in particular bigger institutions and bigger spaces. They absolutely should be, but you also should be thinking about how you are also taking that big institution, taking that funding, taking that programming, and making sure that you're going into communities with communities of color and with Black communities as well. Like, that should be something that should be very, it shouldn't be this one-off thought. It should be something that should be implemented into how you go to work to make things equitable.
Thank you for that explanation. So let's dig into that a little bit further. How do we correct this issue? How do we make sure that these artists and their work are not being exploited and that they are not having to change the way that they present their art and show up as their authentic selves in these spaces?
Yes, and thank you, because you did mention about this conformity thing, which I didn't totally speak to. But yeah, I mean, again, I think that's just like the culture and the climate, right? People of color, Black folks are always conforming to be able to have access and to be able to be successful. And so, again, this isn't something that is not, this is something that's foreign to the art world. So I think that, it should be, I'm thinking a little bit on that, of my thoughts around it, in how I respond. I'll say that. I mean, first off, if we're going to be honest, like being honest and calling that thing out, like speaking to it. I think oftentimes we go around how we're speaking to this, but and for the sake of, maybe you feel like you might be blackballed, or for the sake that that might mean you might be deemed difficult to work with, or, you know, all of that. But I think that we need to be calling these things out of like, hey, this is actually not benefiting Black artists of color, and in the communities in which they come from, to do the exploitation, to forcing them to conform in a way. And they might be like, we're not conforming, but a lot of times that does happen in the ways in which they have to, you know, whether that's visual art, whether that's music, or may be, they have to fit into a certain mold to be able to have access into these spaces. And because They want to be careful around like how it is consumed by white audiences, right, as well. Because then it's, you know, yes, now we're in a time where, you know, equitable is a buzzword and equality is a buzzword, and we're talking about inclusion and all of these words, and like that it sounds great in theory, but a lot of times it's not really happening in practice. And we're now in a time where, of course, with the shifting and the pushing around, what does it really mean to say like Black Lives Matter? What does it really mean to talk about like everyone having, you know, having access and having equity around any and everything that you can think about? So all of that sounds great, but I think we need to be calling out when that's not really happening. We need to call out when the funding isn't really going to, if you're saying this is a thing, then the funding needs to reflect where it's going and what's happening. The program needs to reflect that. And it needs to be something that is consistent and ongoing, because we are all work in progress and we're always evolving. So that is something that needs to be a continuum, not something that happens a few times out the year, not something that just happens during Black History Month, not something that just happens during Women's Month, not something that's happening due to an anniversary of Michael Brown being murdered, right? So like thinking about how is this happening as a continuum, we need to call these things out when they're not, when we see that this isn't really what's, if the actions aren't lining up with the words. And I think the last thing I want to speak to as far as that is, again, treating people as whole people, like I said, and then I think also having community say for real and like what that looks like. So it isn't just a board of folks that are making these decisions around how they go about doing program and how they go about working with the community, but like actually pulling in artists, actually pulling in folks in the community to ask them what does this really, how will this work? What does this look like to make things more equitable? What does it look like for you to be able to express yourself as an artist for real and not feel like you're having to conform to something? So I think like having the conversations and then actually putting particular metrics and things in place so that that actually is happening. But I think the first thing is to really speak to it and call it out when it's not happening. And if there's a pushback or if there's a consequence around that, then you speak to the fact that this has been a consequence of that, because that's something to also unpack as well. Because if you're truly wanting to be better around a thing, you don't then condemn or you don't then punish said person or group for speaking to it, right? So like, I think those few things that I named could be a starting point.
Thank you. That gives us some things that we need to work on within this funding community, and extending this and opening up this conversation to those that we work with. There is a question in the chat. Have you worked with any institutions that have made you feel very valued? And what is it that they did or said that made you feel that way?
Great question. Thank you. Yeah, so I've really only worked with a couple institutions. So I had the privilege of doing some teaching artist work through the Pulitzer Arts Foundation at Covenant House a couple years ago, which was great. And partly that was because, I'm gonna be honest, I had relationships, right? Because that's another thing too, having relationships. I was lucky to have relationships with a couple great folks that worked in that institution and thought of me as an individual that would be great to do this teaching artist work. And then the other is I've worked very closely, like I said, with Herb Arts. I've done curating work with Herb Arts for multiple years at this point. And Kay, like he was one of the first people to push me to call me a curator when I didn't even know what really a curator was or what that looked like or if that's really what I'm doing. He was one that pushed me to call myself a curator, to call myself a leader in this way as it came to speaking to the times with art. So like a lot of the projects and events that I did was speaking to social justice issues or speaking to things that was of importance or like just pushing culture forward. So those two institutions, I felt valued in that way. But also most of the times I feel the most valued is just within community, right? So my artist friends, my artist family, artists that I work with. So most of the artists that I work with at this point, we have an ongoing relationship where I've worked with them for a number of years. So anytime I hit them up, they call, like they answer the call. And I think that's a testament to how I have shown up as a person and as a curator, to where I value them, right? I don't want to exploit them, right? I want them to be able to create, and I want them to be able to get paid off of their work. I want them to be able to have a platform and access to do that. And then the community that comes out and supports me. I'm blessed to have a pretty decent following at this point of the things that I do, and how people thank me for the events, for the shows, for the different things that I've put together and put out. Like I'm very intentional, I'm very thoughtful. I try to move with how I'm called, how God has placed me, and with integrity and when I do anything. So I think that that is a reflection when people come to events and shows that I have. So the feedback from that always keeps me grounded, makes me feel valued. Even in the times where I'm questioning myself, somehow I'm reminded of that from input from folks.
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Jessie.
Great
Before
question.
I ask Kristian the next question, let's engage in a little audience participation. If you all could put in the chat the first word that comes to your mind when you think about the intersection of arts and equity. I'm going to count to 3, and they call this a chat bomb. This is what I've learned over my year of being in Zoom world. So on the count of 3, go ahead and put the first word that comes to mind when you think about the intersection of arts and equity. 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's see. History, access, stagnant, that's a strong word. Interpretations, together, narrow, universal. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so these are a lot of terms that we have been discussing inwardly and in various groups that we are all connected with, trying to make these connections and grow this space to be more inclusive and accessible for all. Thank you all for your participation in that. Kristian, I have another question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the first step to bridging the gap between art and equity?
The first step in bridging the gap with art and equity. Good question. And I might sound a bit redundant in maybe some stuff I've already said. But I think the first step is like kind of simple, but not but like for an individual, whether they be a youth, a child, or an adult, like saying that they're an artist. Saying that they're an artist, owning the fact that they are a creative. And I think going from there, and then I think that's the first step. But then I think after that, as far as bridging the gap is, again, I think really meeting folks, meeting artists, meeting community where they are. Because again, I think a lot of times, and like I mentioned this, and I think I use the POC example as an example because I think it really surprised me, because I'm someone like my mother is a retired St. Louis public school teacher, and I did have access to go to different things and learn particular things, but so even in that I had a certain level of privilege. So everybody didn't necessarily have that to where they were able to go to galleries or go into different museums and go into different spaces. So I think it's being able to bring art into communities. So I think that's why Herb has been so important and pivotal, and why I have been very intentional about continuing to work with Herb over the course of the years is because that is in Old North, that is in a community with predominantly Black folks. So they're able to have art in their community. So I think I think that there's nothing more equitable than folks being able to have access to something. So I think there needs to be more of that, of what it looks like to have art in schools and have have art in communities with people of color, with communities of color, Black folks specifically, because I think Black communities and Black artists tend to be like isolated the most in some of these instances. So I think owning that first, and then how are we making sure that things are coming to communities, coming within the community, coming to artists, and just them being able to have the access to see it and having the access to be able to create it.
Thank you for that. That accessibility portion, and then encouraging and nurturing and owning the artist that's within all of us, or the creative that's in all of us and in others, I think is an important and pivotal step in bringing this more to the communities that need it so much. So with that, we can open up the floor for questions. So if you didn't get a chance to put your question in the chat, or you have a question for Kristian, we can take it now.
Also, I just want to say, if you are following along on Facebook, we are monitoring the comment section there too. So please feel free to share your questions that way.
I have a question. Do you have any advice for the up and coming youth artists as far as like how to maintain true to themselves in these spaces?
Good question. A couple. So I think them being able to be in communities where they're able to be their true selves first. And I know oftentimes that's kind of difficult sometimes to find. And like, I'm shamelessly plugging Herb a lot, but they have done this where they have worked with youth poets and youth artists, and allowed them to just be themselves and be creative. And myself, I'm trying to get better at this, but I've also always attempted to include youth artists in shows that I do. It hasn't been every show, but there has been some shows that I've included. And, you know, I treated them and respected them just like I would an adult artist, right? I didn't make them feel like they're any less of anything because they're younger, or that they're a youth, but that they're an artist and they have every opportunity to be able to create and have their art on the wall. Whether they, like, I've had an artist as young as like 8, and someone that was like 21, right? So like having them see that they're able to have access to that. I Still Love Her, which is one of my most popular curated shows, a celebration of women in hip hop. I do a closing event where it's an all women MC showcase, and I've had youth artists perform at that. Funny, one of the main youth artists that come out is actually the sister of one of my artist friends who usually submits to a lot of my shows. So Tiana Bojo, shout out to her. She's the artist, and then her sister, Kid Huncho, is an MC, and she's dope. But she started coming and doing performances, and I Still Love Her when she was like 15. So like, and like she can spit, you know what I'm saying? And and even though some of the content to some might have been like, she's too young to be speaking about these things or spitting this, like I didn't censor her. I didn't say she had to do anything but other than come and be herself, right? And I've supported her in that. So I think that is really just allowing youth to be able to find their way, as they're growing up from being young to being adults, but also as they're growing up from being an artist that is young to and providing the space and being able to plant them in places where they feel like they can be their most real authentic self. So I think finding those places, and then again, while we're having this conversation again around pushing more, and again, I'm not saying that none of this is happening, right? Programming and things like that isn't happening. It's absolutely happening. But again, I think it's more of like having more of that and making sure that it's showing up in the places where there is a lack and filling in those gaps more of how you, I mean, hell, we talk about, we talk about all of this disparities. We talk about crime and violence with youth and all of that, and how it's disproportionately with youth of color, Black youth specifically. And a lot of that is, a lot of times we talk about outlet, but one of the biggest and most beautiful things is that kids are creative, youth are creative. And a lot of this stuff is being taken away and has been taken away out of schools and out of communities, to where that outlet to be able to create is not as should be and could be. So I think a few of those different things I feel like should be put in place at least as a starting point in thinking about how we allow our youth to flourish in the arts.
Thank you for such a great question.
Yes, it was a great question.
This is going to be our last question. What are the ways in which institutions and creative spaces like Herb Arts can and should be supported by the public and by other institutions? And why do you think spaces that are fostered for Black artists do not receive the same support as Eurocentric institutions?
Racism, oppression, injustice, all of the isms and all of the stuff that like people say is a thing, but it's a thing. I definitely think it has a lot to do with just a lot of that nasty stuff. And I think, again, I don't think it's like Black spaces and Black artists are valued in the same way. It's like a lot of times the community doesn't value it the same way. And that's not a knock or any fault of the community. But again, like I said, everybody doesn't have access to appreciate art in the same way. That doesn't mean you don't appreciate it, but like there's a lot of folks that never been into a gallery. They don't know, like there have been times where at shows, and never to be an a-hole about it, but it's a teachable moment in telling folks like this is how it is when you come into a gallery space. Like you don't touch art, right? You don't lean up against art. These artists have took their time to create something, and this is how we move about in the space. So I think that, and also I think how can community support is that, like really honestly support, right? So come out to events, come out to shows, tap into the programming, allow youth to come into these spaces and tap into the programming, and like speak to the fact that like I'm saying this as, and I talked to MK briefly, and I was like, I'm going to name drop Herb a lot, but I'm using Herb as a vocal point because Herb is not the only herb, right? There's herbs all across the country when we're thinking about this, right? And like I said, there's other Black gallery spaces, but it's something unique about Herb and being a nonprofit and doing programming specifically around art for youth, and then for adults. So I think it's like speaking to the fact, like it was a pandemic, right? There's a lot of other white-led institutions or bigger institutions that have been able to sustain, have been able to still flourish and be able to do things, during this pandemic. And Herb has done very little. Like they've had a couple shows scheme, in the broader scheme of things, like herb isn't really functioning right now because of the pandemic. So that's a clear imbalance of like this institution like not being able to do much of anything versus institutions that are still to be able to have a robust scheduling and shows and funding that's being funneled in a way that other spaces aren't. So again, it's like posing the question and then pushing like for not just to be conversations, but like what is the action behind how are we making sure that an institution like herb is still being able to flourish during an unprecedented time in history with this pandemic, but once a pandemic is over, right? Because clearly before the pandemic there was still a lot of, again, going back to like this whole struggling artist thing. Why is it that Black institutions are institutions of color, and why do Black artists and artists of color always have to be in this like struggling state of like very grassroots, and if you want to stay grassroots, then stay grassroots. But I'm saying, why does it have to always be this very like piece by piece, bit by bit way of being able to operate and function and all of that? So I think it's really thinking about that, because I would hate for it to be to a point where, and a lot of times it's a little too late, because then now it's like, oh, now we're doing this big thing to like save this institution because this institution is now on the brink of closing, right? And it's like, but for X amount of years, there wasn't this robust following and support of a way. And I'm also saying this, to be clear, I'm also saying this because a lot of the community in which comes in herb, whether it's artists or whether it's community, again, are folks of color. It's Black folks. So again, they're not coming from a lot of wealth or disposable income or wealth to be able to put into this institution. Other institutions are. So, but I still think there's something to say about like, hey, if you say you love art, you say this is something that, you love it, it's great, you support it, you're an advocate, you're all of this. I think we should also be thinking about, just like when you give to any social justice, right? Like some of these, I'm not saying that you fund whoever you want to fund. However, there are some institutions that get tons and tons of donations, and not even just with like a regular donor like you and I, but from grant funding, whether they be on a national, federal, whatever. So like start doing a little bit more work and being a little bit more conscious about where are the other spaces, where are the grassroots, where are the smaller spaces and institutions that I can be supporting and giving my money to. So I think that is also something to think about when you're giving your funding, giving your donation to whatever said institution of the arts. Also be looking at these smaller institutions, and particularly institutions of color that are also, doing work, and seeing how you can support them and fund them in the same way. At least have the thought around it and how you can support. So I think that's a start.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Such a great question. That is a great place to end our conversation. Cynthia, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you all. That was great. Within a week of this conversation, I know a lot was said, a lot of resources were thrown out, a lot of names, a lot of ideas. So we will be sending out within a week of this conversation a FAQ document with these questions, some resources. If you had some questions that you didn't, they just kind of popped in your head afterwards, sometimes you got to sleep on it. You can feel free to send us those questions. We'll include them. But if you registered for this Catalyst conversation, we have your contact information. You will receive the document. It will have the questions from today and any others that we think are important, maybe some other little tidbits from Kristian, and then resources that will help you along this arts and equity journey. Please join us on June 15th for our next Catalyst conversation. It will be at 6:30 p.m. It will be on the topic of the business of art with our Soul Shed University founder, Jamarco Britton, where we'll discuss the experience of making a living and creating business in the art. Soul Shed is the 4th annual Startup Creative Competition winner, which is a program supported by the Arts and Education Council and the PNC Foundation. It includes that, along with that startup competition, it includes prize money, a year of free office space in our Centene Center for the Arts, which is our arts incubator, and professional development and mentoring. Register today at keeparthappening.org/conversations, the same place you went to register for this Catalyst Conversation. As I said at the beginning, Catalyst Conversation is a series of 4 conversations. Register today. Thank you so much for sharing and joining with us in this important conversation on arts and equity. Thank you, Kristian. Thank you, Jessiree. Thank you, Andy. And thank you to all of you for participating. Kristian, I want you to leave us with a final word. I really appreciate it. I think this was a great way to start the 2021 year of Catalyst Conversations with A&E launching publicly our DEI framework and with this conversation around arts and equity. So, Kristian, I want you to have the final word.
Awesome. Thank you, Cynthia. I raised my hand because I was like, ooh, because I forgot.
I'm not going to
You
leave
gave me
you.
the final, you gave me the final word anyway. So really quick, because Cynthia asked me to put some work in the backdrop. So like I said, in addition to doing everything, I great, like I love being like an art collector. So there's a couple pieces in the background I hope folks can see, but I want to move out the way for you all to see it as best as you can. But so the piece here is by Roland Barrow, and the piece here is by Dell Chambers. So Roland Barrow is like honestly one of the dopest artists that I know. And actually me and him dated, like we've gone to school together since middle school, and now he's off doing amazing work. And Dale, for those that I'm sure folks know Dale is also like great, amazing artist. You've seen her work in a multitude of spaces. So these are 2 of my most favorite pieces that I own. Not to take away from any of the other pieces because I love them all, but these are in particular 2 of the most beloved pieces that I have. And outside of that, I'll just like to say, thank you again for everybody who hopped on. And I'll just say, just continue to just be very mindful and thoughtful of how we support art, how we support art, how we support artists of color, how we support communities and have those communities having access to art, and how we're all creatives. We're all creatives. You might be like, no, I can't do this, but we're all creatives at heart. We're all have been blessed to do something creatively. So I charge folks to be able to tap into that creativity and to really just be thinking about making sure that when we're supporting art, that we are supporting all of art, and all of this many facets and many identities. So making sure that we're supporting artists of color, that we're supporting women artists, that we're supporting queer, trans artists, that we're supporting individuals with disabilities, that we're thinking about all of the many intersections of folks that are creatives, and that we're making sure that we are supporting everyone in all of this holistically. And that art saves lives. Art is something that has honestly aided me many times to fight against depression, anxiety, and many things. So I would like to say thanks to art, to the artist world, to those that I'm in contact with and connection with. And yeah, so thank you again. This has been an honor. This has been a great conversation. And thank you for allowing me to speak very candidly and very honestly and openly as well, because sometimes, like getting to our point, a lot of this truth isn't stated in a real way, in an authentic way. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.